Hello, everybody. It's great to see a large number of participants there already. I'm going to wait a couple of minutes until I start properly. So yes, please do add in the chat where you're tuning in from. I'm in Oxford, in England. It's been pouring all day, so it's nice to be able to reach out. It's sunny somewhere, Kingston, Jamaica. Spain, I'm getting envy now. Going almost too quick for me. I think I just saw the Midwest, USA, Leeds, Durham. It's wet in Worthing. Great, okay. I think that's my requisite time to make sure that everybody has been able to join. So I'm going to share my screen now and get started. Okay. Right, thank you again to everybody for tuning in. It's really wonderful to see so many people. My name's Charlotte, and I'm here with two hats on, although they're very similar hats, as you will discover. One of them is as director of the Stephen Spender Trust, and another as also director of the Queen's College Translation Exchange, which is an organisation based at the Queen's College in Oxford that I set up a couple of years ago. Okay. Can you just tell me in the chat that you can see a slide saying today's talk, and then I will. Thank you. Great. Somebody just used the raised hand function, which is very good to know that's working. In that case, could we, before I tell you what I'm going to talk about, I'd just like to know a little bit about you. I know where you all are at the moment. Could you raise your hand if you are in the UK? Okay, 150 something. If you're not in the UK, sorry, that's a bit of a generalization. If you're a secondary school teacher, primary, brilliant, very glad there's some primary teachers here. And just because I'm a Germanist, I always like to know if there are Germanists in the room. If you're a German teacher, could you put your hand up? There's no favoritism, but you know, 57, wonderful. And I think my final question is, have you done any creative translation before? Part of what today is about is trying to figure out what creative translation actually is. But if you consider that you've engaged in it before, then okay, great. Thank you very much. Somebody said not a clue in chat, which is excellent. Good, okay. So today I'm going to talk to you about creative translation, specifically creative translation to raise aspiration, but there's all sorts of facets to that, which will hopefully become clear as I go through. I'm going to start by talking about what creative translation is. Then I'm going to talk about what is it for, and why should we bother concerning ourselves with it. And then I'll go into some examples of how the organizations that I run are currently working with creative translation. Firstly, talking about translating picture books, then translating poetry with a particular focus on how you can bring vocab and grammar into that, translating graphic novels, and looking at how that can be integrated into GCSE curriculum, virtual creative translation, and finally ways for teachers to get involved. If you're not a teacher, by the way, you're still very welcome. But this talk is mainly aimed at those who are teaching languages in some way in any setting. And I think those last 2 points, virtual creative translation and ways to get involved, really go to the heart of why I'm so glad to be here today. And I did want to thank the Language Show for inviting me to speak. So my projects have been involved with creative translation for a long time, but over the past year, past couple of years really, we've really started to focus on how we can give teachers the tools and the resources to integrate these creative translation activities, which you'll be experiencing today, how you can integrate them into your practice. And so over the past couple of years, we'd started to think about virtual resources and training for teachers, and we'd started to set up partnerships between professional translators and teachers. And of course, in the past 8 or 9 months, wherever we're at now with the pandemic, there's been a real explosion of that side of things, both in terms of what we're able to do and also in terms of the need and the interest in that. So lots of what I'm going to be talking about today is really work in progress, but hopefully what you'll see is that the direction that we're moving in is very much towards resourcing teachers, training teachers, giving you the skills and the motivation to be able to integrate this and take it forwards in your own practice. So I think that covers that. Yes. Before I start talking about creative translation, I did want to talk very briefly about myself and how I ended up here, and because I think that helps to show what my aims are and how that informs what I'm doing. So as I said at the beginning, I'm a Germanist by training, and where that took me first of all was to be a lecturer in German at the University of Oxford, which was a job that I loved because of the teaching side of things. And I became particularly interested in widening participation at that stage and getting involved in programs, thinking about how to promote languages in particular, because we were seeing decline in numbers of applications, which seemed to me like a terrible tragedy. And so one of the main activities that I got involved in there was to help Catherine Cole, who many of you will know, to set up something called the Oxford German Network. And here's an opportunity for another raised hands. The Oxford German Network, we run the Oxford German Olympiad, which is a national competition. If you've entered your students in the Oxford German Olympiad, perhaps you could raise your hands. I guess this is only out of the number of Germanists that we have. So that was a really a sort of early experience for me of how creative tasks can be used to raise aspiration and to get young people involved and excited about learning languages. And then finally, for 10 years until last year, I ran a project called New Books in German, which promotes German language literature in the UK and elsewhere and tries to get more books translated into English. And through that, I started to I kind of developed an interest in and contacts in the literary translation and the publishing world, did lots of translation workshops, worked with lots of professional literary translators, and really started to see that translation is a really exciting way of engaging learners of all ages, right through from primary to older adults. A really great way of engaging them in languages. It's a really exciting collaborative way of being a linguist, and that it's accessible to all skill levels as well. You can have a great translation experience as a native speaker or as a bilingual speaker, just as much as you can if you hardly know any of the language and you have to use lots of resources. And I'll be talking more about resources shortly. So what all of these experiences brought to me, I'm just to say that I'm seeing questions appearing, and I think maybe I didn't say at the beginning that I will leave time at the end to answer your questions. So please do pop them into the Q&A, and I will endeavour to leave time at the end to address as many as I can. What these 4 sort of career experiences suggested to me is that there was something to be done with translation and widening participation at university and raising aspiration for language learning, and that one of the reasons that translation workshops work so well to raise aspiration and to get people excited about language learning is because, next slide, it's about showing and not telling. And this is kind of one of my mantras at the moment. What we want to be doing is to show young learners how exciting it is to be a linguist, rather than telling them that being a linguist is exciting and that it will be useful to them in their future careers, and that it will allow them to travel, and so on. Having experienced that in widening participation events, you get such a different response from the young people if you just tell them those things versus if you actually do an exciting, rich, creative activity with them. So that showing, not telling idea, which of course can also be talked about in terms of intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation, is a real motivator for everything that I do. So translation workshops became a real focus of my outreach work. And this slide is just an example of an early workshop that I designed, which I still really love. So again, for the Germanists among us, based on Emil die Detektive, which is a great text to use for translation. You've got translating humor in there. They've all got kind of idiosyncratic names. You have to think about translating the names. You have to think about how you translate 1920s Berlin street slang into English. And there are also film versions in both languages, so you can use film to enrich work like this. So where this led me was to have the real pleasure of becoming director of the Stephen Spender Trust a couple of years ago, which is an organisation that promotes multilingualism and language learning, primarily through the Stephen Spender Prize, which hopefully some of you have engaged in, another opportunity to raise hands, and education programmes which have generally been known under the umbrella of translators in schools, although there are various names that we're using now for our education programmes. And then at a similar time, I set up the Translation Exchange that I've already mentioned in Oxford, which has very similar aims, but does that work through the university, and so involves undergraduates in going out to schools and doing translation workshops. And we also have a new prize that's launching kind of at the moment for translation in schools, and I'll be talking about that shortly. Okay, that's a preamble that was perhaps a little longer than I'd intended. And now to get to thinking about what creative translation is. So there are various organisations and people engaged in this. One person who's really important to my work is the teacher Katrina Barnes. He's based in Cambridgeshire. And we did a webinar for ALL London together in the summer. And as you'll see later, we're continuing to develop some work together. And of course, Stephen Spender Trust has been doing this work for much longer than I've been involved with the trust. But what I'm doing here is just listing some of the key elements as I see it for creative translation, and for creative translation to be particularly effective with young learners. So at the moment, we always move from another language into English. It's that kind of translation. it always involves authentic texts, and it creates an authentic experience, and they're slightly different things. So authentic text is pretty obvious. We use lots of literature, but in a very accessible and non-intimidating way. But it's also about the authentic experience. And again, this is something that Katrina Barnes is really good on. The idea that you are getting your students to you're giving them a translation brief or an assignment, so that you're treating them as if they are translators. So you might say you're translating a picture book. You are year 5, but you're translating it for the year 1s in your school. So you have to think about who your audience is. Or here's a short text that you're translating for a literary magazine, which is going to be published next month, and they need the copy by the end of the week, and it needs to be X number of words long, and so on. So it's an authentic experience. It's a real life experience, and that's a really important aspect of what we're doing. Visual prompts. So we use images as much as possible as we can, as you'll see as we go through. Of course, whenever you look at an image, you're already doing kind of translation, because you're translating it, or when you talk about an image, you're translating it into words. And so it's a really good way to start the translation process, to start with pictures. It's task-based, which is something we found particularly useful when schools were closed. We use resources as much as is necessary. It's part of our part of the rationale for what we do is that we want to show that to be a linguist, you don't have to be fluent. You don't have to be a walking dictionary to be a linguist. The professional translators that go into classrooms, they won't know all the words, but they will be very, very good at using resources, at using glossaries, dictionaries, even Google Translate if you use it judiciously. But also some of the activities that we can do can show how the limitations of Google Translate. It's a very collaborative activity. It really lends itself to group work. It can involve performance. So if the workshop is on translating poetry, for example, then you can have groups reading out their translations at the end. Same if you're translating a bit of a play, of course, you can turn it into a proper performance. It very much lends itself to adaptable templates, and that's something we're really working on, as you'll see, that we're very keen to move away from the wheel being reinvented every time somebody does some creative translation in the classroom, but to look at developing templates that can be adapted. So this is the picture book template, this is the graphic novel template, and so on. And finally, we usually, when this is a whole workshop, we like to start with a multilingual warm-up, which is about creating a multilingual space in the classroom. So one of the real benefits of this work is that it democratizes languages. It removes language hierarchies, and it means that those who speak languages other than English at home are able to bring those into the classroom. And that's a really, really important part of the process in terms of activating the young people as linguists and making them recognize their skills, whatever level they are and whatever language it is. So, as an example, firstly, I just wanted to show you some multilingual monsters, which is a multilingual warm-up that we often do with primary. This is from a workshop that Stephen Spender Trust translator Ruth Ahmadzai-Kemp did before schools closed in the spring. And she was working on a picture book that was about things that are under the sea. And so she asked them all to draw some under the sea monsters, multilingual monsters. And then, as you can see, they're invited to label the monster with any languages that they know. We always try to include English slang here as well, so that what you have there is, on paper, you have the kind of multilingual multiplicity in that classroom, and they're learning from each other right from the outset. It's a lovely activity. But my personal favorite activity for creating that multilingual space and getting people thinking about what translation is and what you need to do to be a translator is to do some idiom translating exercises. Somebody's already said they love idioms in the chat. Excellent. So I'm going to use the chat a little bit here. I'm going to have to go through it quite quickly. But what I'd like you to do is just to let me know what German, what German, sorry, my German obsession, what language you see, and if you can translate this idiom. So we start with the language. It's German. Then we do a literal translation. Does anybody want to pop a literal translation of this into the chat? It has to be literal. You're jumping ahead. You're being too clever. You go me on the cookie. You're going on my biscuit. Brilliant. You go to me on the biscuit is the literal translation of this lovely German sentence. But as you've already said, oh, there's the biscuit. As you've already said, this means you get on my nerves. Brilliant. Loads of input from the chat there. Thank you. I think all German teachers in the audience are participating here. Okay, next. What language is this? It is French. You can do a literal translation, please. I have other cats to whip. Yeah. Sorry. I actually, yeah. I think I'm going to change that image because that cat does actually look like it's being whipped. But anyway, the other thing I should say is that most of these idioms were developed by students as part of my Queen's College programme, so I can't take the credit for them or the images that they've chosen. And I've got other fish to fry. Yeah, I have other better things to do. I have other fish to fry. Great. What language is this? Spanish. Oh, sorry. Can somebody give it a literal translation? Yeah. I have no Spanish, but brilliantly, Google Translate actually did translate this as to give somebody pumpkins. So I'm pleased to say that Google Translate failed on this. Who can translate this into an English idiom? Jemandem einen Korb geben. Somebody said in German. That's right, isn't it? That is the German version. Pumpkins or courgettes. Does anybody know what this means? I hope it does mean this. Okay, there are our pumpkins. Yeah, thank you. To reject somebody, to give somebody the brush off. What language is this? Definitely not going to read this out. It is Mandarin, Chinese. And I will whiz through this actually. To cast a brick to attract jade. Actually, do we have any Mandarin teachers? You can raise your hand. Oh. Yes, oh good, 15, brilliant. To cast a brick to attract jade. Maybe shout at me in the chat. I'm at Mandarin teachers if this is wrong, but one of our Chinese undergraduates, Chinese studying undergraduates, designed this little activity. There's your brick, there's your jade. Oh, somebody can't see anything but me. You might need to change your settings. If anybody has a suggestion for Lorna so that she can see the presentation, could you put it in the chat for Lorna, because I don't think there's anything I can do from my end. Thank you. Okay, and it means to toss an idea out there, I'm told. Okay, last one. Again, I'm not. Thank you, this is Dutch. The monkey comes out of the sleeve. Thank you, Lisa and Danielle. The monkey comes out of the sleeve. Who would like to guess, or who knows as our monkey? Yeah, to let the cat is out of the bag. I've ended with this one because it's my favorite. Again, this came to me through a group of students in Norwich who were doing one of our programs, and one of who was studying Dutch. And what I love about this is that you can really use it as a way to empower students and show them how much they can infer from just looking at languages that they don't know. So de Arp kommt, etc. You just ask them, where is the monkey? Where is the monkey in this sentence? And somebody, yes, it was the MA Literary Translation at UEA. It was, thank you. And somebody will say, the monkey is up because it looks like the English ape. And then you've immediately, really easily showed them that they can make educated guesses, that they don't have to look at these words that look like complete nonsense and be intimidated by them, that they can work with them and make progress. And I think that can be a really powerful moment for a young or an older linguist. Okay. I'm going to talk now about why we do this sort of activity. Perhaps before I do that, just to give a bit of background to the idiom exercise, it's, I hope you agree, a fun activity. It's one of the reasons I like it. It's light, it's a collaborative, people can work together on it, but it's also a really tangible way of showing what creative translation is, because it shows you that you cannot translate literally. You can't just look up each individual word in a dictionary and write it down and then you're done. There is always, in any translation, there's always going to be a creative input. So that's a really kind of powerful moment for showing that you're always going to have to go through these different stages. But nonetheless, it also shows that you do have to do that first stage of decoding. You have to understand the words. You have to know how the words relate to each other. So in other words, you have to know the vocab and grammar before, as the first step in that process. There's some great suggestions coming in the chat. It's cultural as well. Yeah, and in fact, that's something that is particularly relevant for that Mandarin example, where jade, you know, when would you have jade in an idiom in the UK? Probably not. But it's a central image for Chinese culture, and so you need to think about how you translate culture as well in these idioms. So, and in fact, I had a lovely experience with a Year 7 group in an Oxford school that we were working in, where a group of undergraduates went in to do a workshop, and they started with some idioms, and then we went on to translate some subtitles for the film Persepolis, that I'm sure lots of you will know. And at some point, when they were shifting their literal translations into what we call creative translations, so when they were doing that shift for Persepolis, one of these Year 7 pupils put his hand up and said, "This is exactly what we were doing with the idioms. It's exactly the same process," which is completely unprompted, and I just thought absolutely brilliant that he's noticed that, and that he's noticed that this is the creative process that he's undergoing. So hopefully you're starting, and in fact the chat is suggesting that you're starting to see what I'm getting at, but I will just run through very quickly some reasons, some of the rationale behind why we do all this. Resilience, problem solving, and creativity are 3 words that came up in a program I heard over the summer, a radio program about education and what education is for. It seems to be what the program was about. And I immediately wrote these words down because they are the words that we're constantly talking about with relation to creative translation. Resilience is about the pupils being faced with something that may intimidate them, that they will not understand from the outset, because it's an authentic text. It may be a short piece of prose, it may be a poem. But just like with the monkey in that idiom, the process that they go through shows them that they can do something with that they do have the linguistic skills, that especially if they work with other people, if they use resources, that they can do it. And so it's great for resilience. It is problem solving, of course, decoding. You have an aim in mind, and you have to go through solve several problems in order to get there. And then the creativity, of course. I think that's really come through in that idiom exercise, especially. Which program is it? I don't know. I'm really sorry, but I will try and find that out, because yeah, I'll see if I can find that. It was on Radio 4, but I can't tell you any more than that. And then I've added in grammar and vocab here because this is sometimes something that we sometimes forget really to stress when we're talking about creative translation. And sometimes the creativity side of things can lead people to think that this doesn't actually have anything to do with the nuts and bolts of the language. And in fact, it absolutely does. And just to go back to what I was saying about the idioms, you know, that's the process. You have to decode, you have to understand the grammar and the vocab. But rather than doing it because the teacher has said that you need to tell them where the noun is in this sentence, or you need to find the adjective and make it agree with the noun, instead of doing it for those reasons, you're doing it very purposefully and very meaningfully because you want to know what this idiom means, and you want to figure out what the words of this particular page of the picture book is, or what the blank speech bubble in this graphic novel is. And so you do that decoding in a very purposeful way. Yes, somebody's just put Ich verstehe nur Bahnhof in as a German idiom. And in fact, that reminds me that I wanted to ask you to put into the chat. I think I'll be able to save the chat at the end of this. Yeah, I wanted to ask you to put into the chat your favorite idioms from your respective languages that you think would work particularly well. That's something that you can just be doing as we go along. Okay. These I will, by the way, put this presentation up on a website that I'll share with you at the end, so that you have everything, because there's quite a lot there, and I will whiz through this, but just to finish off this idea of the value of what we do. We usually think about it in terms of cognitive, cultural, creative, and social benefits. I've already talked here about the careful attention to language and how it works, decoding, inference, prediction, and word choice. I think that's pretty straightforward. Cultural capital is really key, I think, to all of this. And one thing that the Stephen Spender Trust did in the summer was to develop multilingual poetry booklets to enable people to enter the Stephen Spender Prize. Because of course, if you don't have lots of poetry books on your bookshelves at home, and you're not in school, which was the case in sort of May, June, when the prize was going on, you don't have that access. And so we've published these booklets of poems, which mean that everybody has access to them. And then of course that by engaging with them in this creative, interactive way, you are enhancing your cultural capital, interest in other cultures, and so on, as well as the validity of community languages, as I've said. Authentic texts. Hopefully I've got that message through. You're engaging creatively in authentic texts. And there's also a real craft element to it. Writing, redrafting, and editing. You can do that with others collaboratively, edit each other's work. It really helps you to see what works linguistically and what doesn't. And social. This is something that is really important to me and that I always look out for in workshops. I think it's partly because one of the first workshops I observed, a year 5 pupil afterwards, when we interviewed her, she talked about how listening was one of the main features of the workshop for her, and that just really stayed with me, that that had been her experience, that listening to her peers was key to it, and also one of the things she really enjoyed. And I think what she also meant was being listened to. So yeah, the social skills are absolutely there as well. I'm loving seeing these idioms appearing. They will definitely be feeding into future presentations that I give. Okay, so just to hammer the point home, if I haven't already, for me, creative translation is such an exciting way of engaging language learners, because it's about process and purpose. So it's not, none of the activities are in a vacuum. They always have a real life relationship. They're always part of a process, and they have a very clear purpose in mind. What's this? Anybody can tell me in the chat. It's a Trojan horse, yeah. So translation is a Trojan horse for creativity, collaboration, etc., etc. And again, that's an image that I find really useful. Okay, I'm getting on some practical examples which somebody's just asked for. I'll talk very briefly about these three modes: picture books, poetry, and graphic novels, and then I'll show you really specific ways that you can get involved in what we're doing. So here's an example of a picture book that we've been working with recently in French. And the basic idea is that you move from literal to creative translation. Usually we start by asking the pupils to reorder, giving them the pictures all out of order, and they reorder it. So they kind of storyboard, they figure out the story just by translating the pictures. Then we give them the pictures with text, and they produce a literal translation, which you've already done with the idioms. And then they work on making it sound natural, thinking about voice, idiomatic language, rhyme, and rhythm. And again, we do this with glossaries. So we would give them this page, for example, and what I would do with this, it would be to focus on that last couplet. Et avant d'être attrapé, le roi s'est échappé. There's some lovely language in there to focus on, but of course, it's also rhymes, and you can have lots of fun thinking about how to stretch your English in order to make that work. At the moment, we're putting together a database of picture books and graphic novels that are particularly good for this kind of activity. Again, going back to that aim not to reinvent the wheel too many times, and we'll be publishing that soon. And so as well as the actual books, a few of which you can see there, we also have video guides by our translators. There's our translator Rahul Berry talking about a picture book, which is visually beautiful, as you can see, and talking about different approaches, different ways that you can approach this in the classroom quite specifically. Translating poetry. The example I'm giving here is a poem by the Swiss poet Angelika Overath, and this is part of a project that we did in the summer where we asked an illustrator to live illustrate some poems, and they're all on our YouTube channel so that you can listen to the poem being read and watch it being illustrated, and this you can see as the final illustration. And so here again, we have an example of kind of how visuals can really come in. I would always start talking about a poem. I would always present a poem by showing something visual first and getting the pupils to predict what the poem might be about, so that they're not so intimidated by the text. And then the text comes. You give them a glossary, and they do a literal translation. And what I would also do with poetry is what I'm calling here language spin-offs. In other words, focus in on particular moments, particular linguistic moments that are useful to you, that you particularly want your pupils to focus on, and look at how they work in the poem, and then maybe do some additional examples. The best one here is Ein Mauersegler. That's a really nice way of looking at compound nouns. Does anybody know what a Mauersegler is? I had to look it up. It's a bird. It's a swift. Excellent. It's a swift. But it literally means wall sailor. Wall sailor. So lovely image, and a really nice example of a German compound noun. So the process there would be zooming in on the text and then zooming out to some language work, some grammar and vocab work, and then zooming back into the text and getting them to do a creative translation where they are really thinking about how to reproduce the voice, the style, the rhythm of the poem. And they're always really, really proud with what they produce. You can ask them to do these then different versions of translation, where you rewrite the poem for another country or another time. Or you can turn the poem into a film, into a comic strip, into a short story. And this is just an example of what I was talking about, the live illustration that we had. Okay, just a quick point about poetry is that the Anthea Bell Prize for Young Translators, which is our new prize that the Translation Exchange is running, this term it's been all about poetry, and if you register for the prize, then you get sent resources and there's just 2 example slides here, and we've had really lovely feedback from teachers on that. Thank you if you're amongst the teachers that have taken part so far. It's a very similar process of literal to creative translation, but with lots of contextual information as well. Okay, I'm running short of time, so I think I will skip 3 graphic novels. Hopefully you get the idea by now, and graphic novels is no different from picture books. It's exactly the same process. We usually use it with older pupils, so secondary would be more likely be secondary would more likely be graphic novels, and picture books would be primary and maybe up to year 7. This is a workshop that one of our Stephen Spender Trust translators developed on the Argentine comic Mafalda. And the reason I'm homing in on this is because she worked closely with the wonderful teacher Anne Coulter to really integrate this into the GCSE curriculum. So as you've got in that quote there, she found some examples from Mafalda that could be related to At the Doctors and used these as a starting point to teach Doller and body parts. So it's exactly the same idea as what I showed you with the poetry, that this kind of exciting literary experience can be a jumping off point for language work. And you can jump off into language and then jump back into the exciting literary work. And indeed, the writer of Mafalda died this year. Yeah. Okay. I'm going to skip through these last few slides. All that's left is just to indicate ways that you can immediately access activities and resources, and ways that you can get involved in the future. So virtual creative translation is what we've been working on at the Stephen Spender Trust through the summer. And there are resources and projects on multilingual creativity. Our resources hub, I will send these links to you, so you don't need to note it down now. This is Katrina Barnes, who I mentioned earlier on. We're developing a new remote training course for teachers with her, which will start in the new year. And this is the basic idea: Introduction to Creative Translation, giving activities for those different kinds of texts and resources. And we're also looking at ways that creative translation can develop virtual exchanges of different kinds. So, for example, a collaborative poetry translation between a classroom in the UK and a classroom in Italy is a really nice way of creating interaction between pupils. I've already mentioned the Anthea Bell Prize, the Stephen Spender Prize. Yeah. And finally, I've collected all the links for today on this URL that you can see at the top, so you don't need to search for everything that I've said. Those are our Twitter handles, and that's my email at the bottom, and I'd be very, very happy to hear from any of you who are interested. Let me just skip back to this one. With Stephen Spender Trust, we're particularly working in Buckinghamshire and Oxfordshire at the moment. We're also developing a multilingual festival, which is basically authors and translators going into schools in certain London boroughs. And then we're also developing work in Greater Manchester, Newcastle and Norwich. So the remote training, go back again. Oh no, that's too far away, isn't it? The remote training is open to all, but if you are in these particular regions, then do get in touch. Okay, I'm going to stop the share and have a quick, I think I'm allowed to go on about 2 minutes or until I'm told to stop. Am I going to provide you with slides? Yeah, I will upload this PowerPoint to the URL that I just gave you, which is on multilingualcreativity.org.uk. there is a link to rewatch this. And please, so there is a Q&A function on the webinar, which I think is easier to, is an easier way to ask me questions so I can see them more easily. Somebody's asked for the link for the Mafalda resources. What I'll do is I'll put in the link to the that has all the links in, and then I'll make sure that that is there. Okay, there's the multilingual creativity link. Yeah, and somebody's asked, teaching A-level translation is nowhere close to creative translation. I believe that's correct, yeah. What we're using translation for is much broader, and it's not about making sure that always making sure that the right words are in the right place. It's the way that it is on the curriculum at the moment is too restrictive for it really to be useful. My email address, I'll put that in too. A couple of people have asked about Google Translate, and I think I'll finish with that, which is that the key is to show students that machines can never do what they will be able to do. And so there are fun ways of showing them the limitations of Google Translate, but also getting them to do this kind of creative collaborative activity shows them that that there are richer ways to engage with text than just typing something into a machine. So it's about kind of showing them, you know, it's very useful. It can be a kind of stage in the process, but it's never going to be the end of the process. But we also don't want to pretend it's not there, because it is, and it is useful. Okay, I've popped my email into the chat. Okay, I think I need to stop now. I'm sorry I couldn't answer all the questions. A lot of them were actually about links, which will all be on that page that I've put into the chat. So thank you very, very much for your interest and engagement today. It was brilliant to see so much going on in the chat. And I will also put all the kind of useful things from the chat, I'll put onto that web page in due course as well. So thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the language show.